Chernihiv is starting to look like Mariupol. There are thought to still be at least 150,000 people here. One of them, Alexander, sends us this.
Мене звати Олександр, я чернігівець. Сьогодні 24 березня, вже майже місяць, як Чернігів протистоїть окупації російських військ. В місті нема зараз ні світла, ні газу, ні води, ні теплопостачання. Але Чернігів стоїть, він протистоїть.
The mayor of Chernihiv took a drive around what's left.
Це ви можете бачити безпосередньо, як виглядає зараз цей район. Так що,
дивіться, усе було пряме попадання.
He says the cemeteries are closed, the morgues having to keep bodies for days. 15-year-old Andrei has been brought from Chernihiv to hospital in Lviv. His mother didn't make it.
And 1 second and I see a yellow explosion, sound in ears, and I just remember, like, I woke up in road, I see the broken car, and I see like my mother going in fire. My mother was ще була жива тоді, коли горіла.
My mother was still alive while she was on fire.
Ukrainian forces claimed a major win in the port of Berdyansk, blowing up a Russian landing support ship, the Orsk, which had been used to bring in vehicles and supplies. Helpfully, Russian state television had run extensive pictures of precisely where the ship was and what it was unloading. Last night, ahead of the Brussels summit, President Zelensky reached over the heads of NATO leaders to their people.
Come from your offices, your homes, your schools and universities. Come in the name of peace. Come with Ukrainian symbols to support Ukraine, to support freedom, to support life. Come to your squares, your streets. Make yourselves visible and heard. Say that people matter, freedom matters, peace matters, Ukraine matters.
Today, to NATO itself, he drops his call for a no-fly zone, asking instead for 1% of their tanks, jets and weapons. The increasingly familiar face of Major General Igor Konashenko at the Russian Ministry of Defense announced they had captured the small city of Izyum. The deputy mayor said there are fears dozens were sheltering in the basement here, and they don't have any equipment to dig them out. Up the road, in Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv, they are still under bombardment. Lilia Potapova has been sending us regular messages, and it's getting more difficult by the day.
I am a half-part ethnic Russian. I never feel any discrimination from Ukrainian state. And now I can hear Russian shelling. And many Kharkiv residents feel the same. They thought that Russians are our friends, and they just can't understand how can it be.
In Mariupol, where Russia would not allow aid convoys in for a month, they are now handing out Russian supplies. But look at the boxes, carrying the same markings as the tanks and planes that came first. In Putin's newspeak, perhaps Z is for victory. Well, in a moment, I'll be talking to the former Ukrainian president, and we'll be live from Odessa. First, let's go to Kathy in Brussels.
Well, here in Brussels, NATO and G7 leaders have ramped up their lethal aid to Ukraine, including an extra 6,000 missiles and £25 million in military funding from Britain. Extra allied forces will be deployed around Eastern Europe to boost defences, as NATO's chiefs said they were in it for the long haul. There were fears too that the horrors of this war could get even worse, and strong warnings to Moscow against any use of chemical weapons. Our political editor Gary Gibbon is across the city at NATO headquarters. Hi Gary.
Well, as
So often with summits like the ones we've seen today, you're often looking at the communique, the detailed conclusions of the meeting. But with this one, to adapt an old phrase, the meetings were the message. President Biden said he wanted the West to show President Putin that they weren't just united now, however much that might surprise him, but they would carry on being united. It was a display of strength, and if you were looking for any kind of differences that were lurking out there, well, maybe on sanctions. Britain and America today announced additional sanctions. The EU tonight at that meeting there is going to be discussing what other sanctions they want to bring forward, and they may well not come to a conclusion. But as differences go in recent NATO history, that is pretty minimal stuff. It's only a few years ago that President Trump came to this smart new building that NATO sits in and more or less suggested that he wasn't entirely sure the entire organisation had any meaning. President Macron here today, he quite recently referred to it today, said that NATO was brain dead. President Putin had very good reason to think, as President Biden was talking about today, that the West was seriously divided. But I think President Biden will leave Brussels tomorrow feeling that he got the imagery he came here for.
This was the West trying to show it could muster the unity President Putin had gambled against. Three of its mightiest collaborations meeting on the same day: the NATO Defence Alliance, the G7 and the European Union.
Your Excellencies, if I can ask you to look into the camera for 5 seconds. Yes, that camera.
At NATO's summit, Ukraine's President Zelensky was beamed into the room, and he made a direct appeal for more munitions and heavier military hardware than NATO has so far been willing to send.
Ви маєте не менше 20 тисяч танків. Україна просила відсоток. 1% від усіх ваших танків. Віддати нам чи продати нам. Але ми не маємо поки що ясної відповіді. Це найстрашніше під час війни – не мати ясних відповідей на запити про допомогу.
NATO leaders agreed to send more forces to Eastern Europe to boost supplies of lethal weaponry to Ukraine. But when NATO's Secretary-General was asked in a press conference if he'd do what President Zelensky wanted, there was a muted response.
He asked you specifically for 1% of all your tanks, for 1% of all your aircraft, for multi-launch rocket systems, anti-ship weapons, a very specific list. What is your clear answer?
We have a responsibility to prevent this conflict from becoming a full-fledged war in Europe involving not only Ukraine and Russia, but NATO allies and Russia. That will be more dangerous and more devastating.
Boris Johnson said President Zelensky wanted jets and tanks to help him relieve the city of Mariupol. And he sounded, in principle, more open to the idea.
We're looking at what we can do to help, but I've got to tell you, logistically at the moment it looks very difficult, but both with armour and with jets. We're very conscious of what he's asking for. At the moment, we're looking at the equipment that we think is more immediately valuable is missiles that will enable the Ukrainians to protect themselves against bombardment from the air, but also to deal with the Grad rocket launchers, the Russian heavy artillery.
NATO leaders discussed how the weaponry they were supplying to Ukraine needed new routes into the country to avoid Russian discovery. And they said the world must be ready for a conflict that grinds on for a long time, with a high risk of spillover into NATO territory.
Nobody can feel safe now. Maybe it will be Poland, maybe it will be Baltic states, but nobody in Europe. Even those countries which are distant from the direct border with Russia, even those countries are not safe today.
The Prime Minister of Japan and the presidents of the European Union then dropped in on NATO's lavish new headquarters for a G7 summit. Another opportunity for President Macron to remind the world of his closeness to President Biden. No new sanctions were agreed, But as President Biden said, these are not the meetings President Putin thought the West would be managing to hold.
Putin was banking on NATO being split. My early conversation with him in December and early January, it was clear to me he didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today.
European leaders were gathering across Brussels, waiting for President Biden to join them.
Thank you very, very much.
But back at NATO, he hadn't finished.
If you're Putin and you think that Europe is going to crack in a month or 6 weeks or 2 months, why not? They can take anything for another month, but we have to demonstrate. The reason I asked for the meeting, we have to stay fully, totally, thoroughly united. Thank you.
For months, he said. Some in Brussels say perhaps for years. President Biden's now at the last of the 3 summits in a day. Tomorrow he heads for Poland and the border with Ukraine.
Well, the US President Joe Biden has now arrived here at the EU Council, and he'll be having that summit to which Boris Johnson isn't invited this evening. More on that later. But earlier I spoke to Roberta Metsola, President of the European Parliament. I began by asking her when the EU will stop funding Putin's war and stop buying his oil and gas.
I think now's high time that we look at our energy independence and, in fact, interdependence between member states as the ultimate goal. Because for us, the green transition is not only about climate, it is about security. So when we look at the need to create a proper common and security defence union, when we talk about a strategic autonomy, that is the time when we have to really say that we're not going to stop until we're not dependent anymore at all on Russia.
But you're talking about it, but you're not united on it across the EU, are you? So every day Russia gets 800 million euros from the EU for its energy. How soon can that stop?
Well, we have that ultimate goal. There are different realities. There are some countries that are almost, if not 100% reliant on Russian gas. For us, the position has to be clear. That is the aim. What do we do in the immediate term? That's what we're working on. We welcome the Commission's policy on this. What do we do in the medium term and in the longer term? Do we have enough gas to take us through the next winter? How do we help our consumers continue to pay exorbitant, unprecedentedly high bills? Once we answer those questions, then everything is possible. We need to look, for example, at unspent funds in order to help our consumers, and then we can really re-diversify and uncouple, ultimately wean off full dependence that we have on Russian gas.
And can Joe Biden help ease the pain for Europe by giving you more gas, for example?
Well, for us, we need to be together with the United States and our transatlantic allies. This is not a European challenge, it's a global challenge. The instability and the ripples that has already been felt are worldwide. In fact, yesterday the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said exactly that. We're also talking about solidarity in terms of humanitarian help, and that means that we would ask also our partners that when we are going to give protection to those fleeing war, then this is something that is jointly responsible. At the same time, of course, when we're talking about gas supply and demand, we have to look at this as a global market, and we would definitely ask for that understanding from all our partners.
There's a lot of talk today. Obviously, this is about talking. But when NATO talks about widespread consequences if Russia uses chemical weapons in Ukraine, what does that mean? What does widespread consequences mean? What does the EU understand by that?
Well, first of all, we need to look at the European Union that has fundamental rules that when somebody is attacked, everybody comes in. That is even in parallel to a NATO scenario, and that is what we have to make sure that when we see our Baltic partners, for example, they are protected as much as they can. That is why we expect also to see from our NATO partners that they are going to up the protection at the borders. It is important, it is crucial, and that is what gives a sense of protection and a sense of comfort to those citizens that have been living all their life, except again next to a very aggressive, volatile, unpredictable neighbour.
But it doesn't help Ukraine, though, does it? Neither being a member of NATO nor EU.
No, for us, first of all, we have been very clear that aid has to arrive to Ukraine quicker, both in terms of military, both in terms of logistical, but also in terms of making sure that the flows of people fleeing Ukraine are helped, are protected. There is a big, for example, problem that we have, and that is being seen with human trafficking of young women. We need to be extremely careful on that, and that is why we might look at our infrastructure to make sure that the rules that we have, are they being used, and if they're not being used, why not? And shall we be able, and this is the momentum, to create new rules in order to protect even Ukrainians that are fighting our war.
But you're clear that widespread consequences, it doesn't mean EU members getting involved in war in Ukraine. Doesn't mean that,
For
does it?
me, widespread consequences mean that all member states, all countries in whose interest it is that this war stops, that we do everything in our power that it does.
Are you going to miss Boris Johnson at this summit?
That's
a no then.
No, I would temper that answer. There are declarations that I would rather not have heard, but there are also statements and reliance that we need also from our UK partners in a post-Brexit scenario, especially in this area with this common challenge that we have.
Would he have been invited if he hadn't compared the Ukrainians' fight for freedom with Brexit?
You have to ask the European Council that.
But that offended.
You have to ask the European Council.
The President of the European Parliament, talking to Kathy. Well, earlier I spoke to the former President of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, and I started by asking if he thinks NATO is now doing enough.
First of all, this is an extremely important day for Ukraine. Today is exactly 1 month while Ukraine having the disastrous Russian aggression and ruin the Putin expectation that within 1 day he take Kyiv. And if NATO do enough or not, my answer would be the following. NATO plan to supply us ammunition, supply us anti-tank equipment and some anti-aircraft, including Stinger. But we spent for a day more than they supply for a week. And in some days, our ammunition would be just finished.
Are you saying that you're running out of the ammunition that NATO has sent, that it needs to send you much more?
I never said you that we are running out, but I definitely said that we need much more. And you should understand that supplying the weapons to Ukraine, it's shortest way to peace.
But before the war started, you were facing charges. Do you accept that once this is over and finished, a proper democratic country will see the judicial process that was started against you completed, and that you will face your day in court?
We don't have a judicial procedure before, because the whole world recognized that this was a politically motivated prosecution, just because of the fact that I am a leader of the opposition. But at the same time, we are definitely fight for democracy. We definitely fight for freedom, including freedom of mass media, including the freedom of election. But that would be after the victory. Today, we have one enemy. And the name of this enemy is Putin.
Right, so do you think the sanctions announced today are strong enough, or do you still want more?
Every single day, we need a stronger sanction for pushing Putin to withdraw his troops from Ukraine. Stop for any single dollar which can be sent to Russia. Because can you imagine that for 1 day, Europe pay more than $1 billion to Russia? And with this situation, do you think it is enough? What his decision was made today? My answer, no.
You say you're a soldier, but I must say you also sound like a politician. And I wonder whether you want your old job back.
I want to disappoint you. Definitely I'm dreaming about the peace. But I'm dreaming about another job. And this job is, I want to be elected as a member of European Parliament, when Ukraine would be the member of European Union. And definitely I wanted this job. Help me.
I just want to ask you about the tactics, though, as well, because the President's office has also said today that this now looks like a war of attrition, that Russia may not advance on the ground, but it can keep sending its missiles, it can keep sending its bombs. If this carries on, when you look at what's happened in places like Mariupol and now in Chernihiv, can Ukraine withstand this kind of bombing for months or perhaps even years?
My answer would be, we never give up. And you should understand, very simple answer, this is the fight of our life. And that's why I am in Kyiv, that's why we are not planning to leave, and that's why we are on the front, and that's why we surprise the world.
Mr. Poroshenko, you are fighting for Ukraine's future and for Ukraine's democracy. So I hope you will indulge me if I put to you what your political critics say. They say Poroshenko was defeated. We don't like him. He was, his business dealings were suspect, and we don't want him back now. What do you say to those critics in the democracy that you're fighting for?
Why I should commend the critics that before the war, the opinion poll demonstrating that I'm a leader of the people trust. But now this is not important, I tell you. Now we united. We don't have a government, president, opposition, we all united. And this is the answer. And please, do not listen in critics, because some of the critics are standing firm on the Russian narrative, standing firm to undermine the unity. And we don't allow them to do that.
Mr. Poroshenko, thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure.